Hello everybody, I am here with Midi and we are going to speak about the 42. We're going to speak about your journey with the gene keys and with human design a little bit, and welcome.
Thank you, what fun.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, just so we have, for me, you have been the Gene Key Society person, that's how I think many of us know you, but would you give us a little bit more about you?
Gosh, where do you want to start the clock, Bella?
I have all the time in the world.
Well, I've been around on the planet a long time. I was born in the first year of the baby boomers. So I feel a lot younger than chronologically I am. But also I often feel quite old these days, particularly since coronavirus appeared. I've actually had the sobering effect of being told I am in that category called senior, vulnerable, and at risk. And that came as such a shock to me. Mm-hmm. So where would I start the clock? Certainly in terms of gene keys. Gene keys and me came at a point when I was actually letting go of a very active doing lifestyle, because I had been, for the first decade of the new millennium, I'd been very preoccupied with development work in Africa. So I'd worked in countries like Rwanda, South Africa, Kenya, working with a whole variety of groups and organizations and institutions. And that decade itself was in pretty marked contrast to what had gone before, which had been very much as a mainstream organization management development consultant, having my own business for 10 years, which grew to be 30 people. And so I was reaching a point around about 2009, 2010, when my body was telling me, it's time to slow down. You can't actually do what you could do 10 years ago. And going off on 3 or 4 day treks to places out in the outback of Africa where they've got no electricity, no water, it's not really great for your kind of body. And I had a couple of brushes with a very nasty virus, and then followed by a more serious one with another virus that I actually caught in the States. And I was needing to slow down. I was needing to go inward and give myself a break. And one of my sons, who is the least likely ever to want to be categorized into any kind of psychological or spiritual system, he's the original creative rebel, said, "Mum, I found something and I think it might be really interesting to you," because I actually found it interesting myself. And he'd discovered human design. And I actually have a theory about human design, which is that it is a saving grace for projectors. Because for the first time in his life, my projector son felt that he was reading stuff about things that really made sense for him. So I started an internet search on human design, and very quickly came across a very interesting to me article, which, well, it was one of those things that that there's a knife going on in the background. On the surface, it was a funny, jokey, even apparently pleasant piece about somebody called Richard Rudd and some kind of a system that he'd developed called the Venus sequence. And underneath there was this real sort of knife going into, it was nasty, nasty humor. But the effect on me was to say, oh, I'm interested in this guy, Richard Rudd. I want to know more. Sounds as though he's got under the skin of something in human design. I want to find out more. So I went on a search for Richard and couldn't actually find him. It was a period when he was not kind of out in the public eye particularly. And eventually I found a book and a dragonfly on the book. And the dragonfly just spoke to me, and that was me and human design. I was off from there and I was straight into Gene Keys. And I then spent about 5 years with Gene Keys, with the book, dipping in a very serendipitous fashion. Every time I dipped in and I found a page, I found amazing wisdom on the page. And then in 2015, I had just decided I was going to try and do some really large scale transcontinental journeying again. I'd got a little bit frustrated always being confined in my local playpen. And I heard that Richard was doing a 7 Sacred Seals event up in Canada, up in British Columbia. Had always wanted to go to British Columbia and thought this is a really good out-of-town tryout to see whether my body could get as far as Canada and back without feeling uncomfortable on an aeroplane. And that was it. I was into 7 Sacred Seals. I actually had a really hard time at the event for all kinds of reasons. But I was captivated by something, and that was the start for me. And later that year, Richard invited me to London to explore the ideas around the Gene Keys Society. And that then became, although I never knew it at the time, that became progressively an almost full-time use of my time until June last year, when I let go of the role of coordinator. I tried once previously to let go, and that hadn't really worked out. But in June last year, I let go. And, you know, I still remember the day when we were together in Findhorn, and we'd held our preliminary meeting to invite people to explore a vision for the Gene Keys Society. The day after that event, which had been a really beautiful, challenging and exquisite process, Richard came to the little cottage I was in Findhorn, and sat down and stretched out his long legs and his hands behind his head, and he said, you know, the joke about this is that probably you and I are the only two people who know at the moment that the Gene Keys Society doesn't really exist. And I've reminded him of that several times over the years. I just loved that because it set, for the reason I loved it was, for me, it set the context for a society that would never become an end in itself. I've seen so many organizational structures set up that become heavier and heavier and more demanding, and they become an end in their own right, and you're pedaling hard to feed the system. And so for me, the Gene Keys Society was always going to be a transitory process. And I'm really excited to see how we unfold in this next stage going forward, with the society having dissolved literally just last month, at the end of last month. I think it's a wonderful time. I think it's no accident in timing. I mean, we didn't know it at the time, but I think it's no accident that it's coming at this time when we're having a worldwide pause and social distancing and turning inward, and you know, really asking ourselves what kind of a world are we part of, and do we aim to be a part of from here on forward. So it's a beautiful, evolving creature, and you know, motivated all the time by this incredible, incredible transmission that has its own wisdom, that decides who it grabs for its own. Yeah, so that's me. I've been involved with setting up a lot of the current Gene Keys processes. I was very much a part of co-creating the original ambassador program, very much a part of a process which I deeply, deeply love, the Delta process. Mm-hmm. But I'm in a beautiful position these days in that I don't have much in the way of responsibility, formal responsibility. I've retained my links with the part of the field that I'm perhaps most passionate about, which is the Multilingual Matters team, which is the group that was co-created to support translators and publishers of Gene Keys across different languages. And apart from that, I'm having a wonderful time playing in the field and feeling gloriously free of responsibility after quite a long period with the Gene Keys Society.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I'm looking at your activation sequence or incarnation cross, and when I hear you speak about this, I hear your purpose, the 32, kind of both when you're saying you tried to step down before it was actually your time to step down. So that 32, knowing, you know, what's worth preserving and what isn't. And if you had to stay a little bit more, that was important maybe for not having the whole thing fail, quote unquote. There's something with that 32 that has to do with knowing what's worth preserving, and you have it both in your culture and in your purpose. So there's something very important of how you ground in that, and maybe would you speak a little bit about maybe the low frequency of that 32 and the higher frequency and how that has, you know, come out in your life?
Well, yes, when you have 32 as your purpose and you have 32 in your culture, that's a pretty all-encompassing effect of 32. Particularly in my own case, I grew up in a very prescriptive, very repressive UK culture immediately after the Second World War, a very, very hierarchical society. And the society didn't make any sense to me, the way it was organized. And so I was always banging my shins against the rules and regulations. It didn't, you know, for example, I grew up in a small village, and I had two particular friends at one stage when I was about 10. One was the local Irish road sweeper, and I met him every day because I took our dog walking. And it was in the days when kids could ramble and roam, you know, far and wide, and not have the fear of God put into them about who they should talk to. The other friend was the man I played tennis with, who wasn't a terribly good tennis player, but he was a very amiable character. And he was the squire of the local manor. So here on the one hand, you have an Irish road sweeper who probably was earning pennies a week, and the squire of the manor, who was the most important man in a hierarchical structure. And for me, they were two very interesting but very different people. And it never occurred to me that they existed in a different relationship to each other or to me. They were people. Mm. So I mean, at the most fundamental level, I didn't understand the society I was a part of. And when it was explained to me, I often disagreed with the explanation given. So I came into conflict quite often with authority. Mm-hmm. And you know, up until about the age of 6, I was utterly confident in my worldview.
Mhm.
I knew what I'd come for. I knew how the world worked. And then a whole succession of curious events happened. Some very difficult things happened in family life and in the society around me. And I ended up getting very sick and ended up in an isolation ward of a hospital for 6 weeks.
Mm.
And during that 6 weeks, I couldn't see my parents. They were sort of, they could come, it was original social distancing. They could come to the other side of a glass. You know, the only people I saw in that time were doctors in white coats and nurses. And I became convinced that I had really, I'd messed up and I was a complete failure. I think that was when the 32 shadow of failure really hit me at a very personal level. And I started bargaining with God. You know, I would be well behaved if he would just let me out. If I could go back, I'd had so many arguments at home, but suddenly home was the glorious place by comparison with this very forbidding, very cold, very miserable, very impersonal isolation hospital. So I was willing to, you know, really be good if I could only be let home. And I really felt I did a deal with God. And every time I fell off the path according to society, which in those days was either parents or school, essentially, then I felt a failure. I felt I was somehow doing it wrong. And moreover, if I didn't, you know, there was this sort of impending thing in the back of me. If I don't do it right, if I don't get it right this time round, then I'm going to be sent back to that horrendous place. So that had a very, very strong and powerful effect, I think, on me for a lot of years. And the pattern of the shadow failure stayed with me. You know, I was a really high, looking back, I was a really high achiever at school. I loved school. It came easily to me. But my self image was that I always focused on what I'd got wrong rather than, you know, what I'd got right. And that was very much reinforced by a very critical family environment and a very critical school environment. You know, I was very rarely praised for the 95% I got right and constantly encouraged to look at the 5% I'd got wrong. So that carried on through. I got places at the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, any university I applied for. And yet I still arrived at Cambridge as an undergraduate, convinced that I was there by mistake. And that whole pattern went for probably another 20 years off and on. It really took a long time for me to work through and come to a sense of myself that I could be comfortable with, and more particularly allow myself to be less than perfect. You know, I have that 18-1 attractor, and that attracts judgment, and it also had me internalizing judgment, and I was infinitely kinder to other people than I ever was to myself.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just sharing your chart so that people can see the 32 and the 32 and the 18.
Right.
And I'm wondering, like, there's something with me because you say the age more or less when you were in the hospital. Like, I feel that at 64, like the confusion of your self-worth, the confusion of the emotions that are triggered when you're taken away from home, and the the non-kindness of having to be with grown-ups in white coats. Like, there's something almost that got confused in you and that wasn't kind, and kind of even goes up in your pearl. I have this as my vocation, and I know how not gentle it can be with yourself.
Yes, that makes sense to me. You know, I mean, I think I lived my memory is that life changed very dramatically after I was about 6.5. And then I had this period of struggle, and then when I was 8, being in the hospital, and that pretty much fits the whole. I mean, and also I have a pattern of crises in my life. You know, I grow through crisis, and I've had some fairly hefty crises at different times, and that was the first real crisis, and it was triggered by child abuse in my case, which then went straight to my physical being. And yeah, yes, that's the 64. Curiously, is I don't know about you, but with the Veda sequence, my 64 is the EQ is one of the biggest struggles for me to really identify what the messages were of that whole piece. And I think in part it has to do with the repression of the one line in my vocation and attractor.
Right.
You know, I and also the kind of survival self-dishonesty in my IQ, because I was very aware that in my teenagehood, being, you know, I do recognize the brilliant mindness of that IQ 59, and I do recognize how I used to go to that place to feel safe, to get out of difficulty, to kind of distance myself from, you know, the fear, the unease, the confusion, the unkindness, all the negative things. It acted as a kind of island for me. But actually, it was a form of survival that was really important to me, but it was also a form of survival that I had to unlearn, because the combination of the 59 IQ with a 62 life work, which is all about the precision and the detail, was that I went into an intellectual space, and that was further reinforced by university and going into research work after university. That was a safe place to be, but it wasn't necessarily where I was emotionally. It wasn't where my center was, or my center is. And so that's where 42 has been, in a sense, I think, my lifesaver, because the detachment that 42 gives me enables me to keep my heart open and so stay centered rather than going into too much of a headspace. I don't know if that makes sense to you as a story, but it feels how I've negotiated life, how I've traversed life, and how I've, over a very, very long time, through some struggles, through some crises, I've learned to keep my center.
Yeah. Well, for me, it sounds so much like my story, because I really, and also knowing you were a management consultant, like it feels like we almost did the same journey. And for me, in my IQ, I have the 25 in line 6. So it's always that objectivity and staying kind of in this constriction, but at the same time, that, you know, knowing that I have that objectivity I can always rely on. But then it goes, for me, I have the 46 here, and that's the love of being in physical form. But when you are in your head, you're not there. I also have a third line, so I didn't want to go into that trial and error with emotions. So for me, the IQ was absolutely where I would hang out. And then also having the 57.4, exactly the same as you in my vocation, the 32.2 is my stability. So also this, I can't, for me, if I had 99 of 100 in on an exam, I would absolutely be so frustrated about that one that I couldn't get it right. And then I would study so that I knew the books by heart, or crazy things that I did to kind of avoid that 1%, instead of knowing that it was easy for me to always do 90, but that was not enough. So that forcing that for the last part. And there's something more that I feel, this is my south node on the design side. And
Oh,
when you said
wow.
bargaining with God, and this is my north node on the design side, bargaining with God, for me there was something like that, like speaking with God. And I feel like that 61 is there. It's like that's the closest place in their whole design to God. And having it in a second line, it almost has to do with the relationship with God. Like that's what, and maybe that's the thing. It for me was like I kind of knew that wasn't me. I was kind of just paying off some debt or getting, but I thought it was always stop tomorrow. I thought that I could maybe be done with school, and then but there was always one more thing. And I think that's the trickiness when we stay in the mind, or when we stay in the IQ, and we think just one more thing, it never stops. And that's why I'm wondering with you, like, what you say, tell us a little bit more about the shift, and what was it that you were reclaiming when you were shifting out from that being blocked in a safe place that wasn't the true place?
Well, I'm not sure how to answer that, Bella. All I can say to you is that I've never had any conscious path in life. I never had any career expectations. I never had any deliberate intentions to do this, this, or this. My whole path has been about falling in love. I'm an incurable romantic. At least I see to this point, I feel I'm incurable. And actually, to this point, I don't even want to look for a cure. I realize, but I've fallen in love with people, with places, with causes, and that has been such an impelling force within me that I've had to take account progressively of the scrapes that I've got myself into, and find my way through and out, and learn. Always looking back, I could see the story. And once I could see the story and could tell the story, I could be outside the story. When I was in it, I'm in the stream, I'm in the flow, I'm in that 2-line flow, I'm living the experience. I don't know what I'm doing or saying almost until I do it or say it. When I can actually stand out and on the bank, and here again I come back to my 42 radiance as being, I think it was my lifeline to survival when I was a child. And I think it's become it became in midlife, when I went through a lot of physical illness, largely through just having overstretched my system. It became my lifeline to good health. And now it's become my lifeline to joy, to delight, to day-to-day enjoyment and celebration of what is. So I think it's almost been, certainly it's been the way to learn to laugh at myself, to get out of that failure shadow place. And I haven't, what's curious, I don't know about anybody else with a 42, but I don't think I'm ever consciously aware of having expectations until the point at which they haven't been met.
Yes.
So I don't set out with any kind of expectation, but I discover that I had an expectation that I didn't even know I had when it isn't met. So it's almost always retrospective. And, you know, I've always had a tendency to, I don't sleep that much. And I spend a lot of nighttime awake, just being, just sifting shells of the previous day's experience and sort of, you know, just putting it into them. It's like having jigsaw pieces and putting them into place, or sifting and sorting shells so that they make a beautiful pattern that resonant, that is coherent. Searching for a coherent pattern in what has happened. And the great thing about not having conscious expectations is that I don't really very often feel disappointed. I feel shocked and surprised when I discover I had an expectation that I didn't know I had, but I haven't vested energy somehow in it.
Right.
So I think that's been a fortunate aspect of life for me. And I don't know whether that's similar for other 42 people or not. I'd love to actually have a group with some 42 people now and see how it plays out in different positions and with different people and different experiences.
I mean, I'm thinking Ashley, who I work with, also has the 42. She has defined sacral and root, so she has the whole channel. So there's something about having it from defined centers where it feels like you can always trust it. It's not the energy coming into you and being other people's, you know, expectations or detachment. It's something that is what we would say in human design, that you can always trust in you, and you have the whole channel. So there's also something about you're both, and I mean, I guess as a consultant, if you don't have that ability, you're not going to be a consultant. You have the starting ability and the ending ability, and to see that cycle and to see through and to look at it after. It's like that whole thing, and to kind of let the flow, because we are going to call the archetype of the 42 the Nomad. So it's kind of also in the play of it, like how does that for you feel, naming the 42 as the Nomad? Does it feel coherent? Can you see that archetype in the 42?
Well, for me personally, to call me a nomad is to describe who and how I've been for most of my life. I would probably associate that more immediately with my 56 core, which is the wanderer. But you know, I lived in Corsica for many years, and I I had a period when I had a home by the sea and a home in the mountains. And I lived in my home by the sea in summer months. And then in the winter months, we would go to the mountains. And then we would reverse it, because actually everybody came to where we lived, which was a particularly beautiful tourist area in the mountains, by the sea, in the summertime. So we would actually then do a sort of summer transhumance, which is the way that Corsicans indigenously actually worked. And I'm just trying to get rid of something on my screen. Hold on a second. Try tonight. Let's do that. So that was a semi-nomadic existence, and that really suited me down to the ground, to have these 2 points. You know, the equinox was the time that we shifted, and it was a wonderful, wonderful way of life, to be up in the mountains for half the year and by the sea for half the year. So nomad is, I also, I know that genetically I have strong origins in the nomadic tribes of the steppes. And I never feel happier than when I'm kind of in that flow of the caravan. You know, I can still reaccess past life and probably past ancestral association with the caravan trails of the nomadic tribes. So for me, it's beautiful. I don't. Is it 42? I would need time to contemplate that, you know, to reach an answer on that. But
I mean, I
there's a
definitely see the 56 too in that, because we were thinking about maybe the archetype for the 42 was the wanderer, but that directly made me feel that, I mean, that is the 56. So there's probably something connected when both are there, and you have it also, you have it twice. So it's something
well.
that is strong for you.
The thing that the thought that pops up in my head in relation to, you know, I can always I can rationalize almost any kind of make a connection, make the synaptic connection with almost anything. What I would say about 56 and 42, and I think they actually make a beautiful combination, is that in a sense they both speak to the outsider role. You know, to the detachment. I have always, as long as I have been aware of myself, I have been able to see myself both in a situation and on the edge of the situation, or even outside the situation. And I think the 56 wanderer, you are by nature, when you travel. And I've traveled a huge amount. You know, I've lived or worked in 5 continents, and I actually here, I seem to have tethered myself. I've tethered myself to the man I love, and he's become quite sedentary. So by definition, I've become quite sedentary. I've actually been in approximately the same area for quite a few years now. But before that, I'd traveled and traveled and traveled. And so it's very natural to me. And I love, when I went to live in Corsica, where I lived sort of off and on for, I had a home there for 18 years, and I lived there virtually full time for 10 years. I actually felt so at home. This will sound paradoxical. I felt so at home because I was in the very clear role of an outsider. I couldn't be anything but, because I was living and playing and working in a community of long time Corsicans. You know, they were an indigenous community. And I was a newcomer, I was an incomer, I was a new arrival, I was an outsider. And although after some years they would say very, very kindly and graciously, they would say, you know, you're one of us, there was always a way, and there still is a way, in which the roots of me were somewhere else in this lifetime, although the deeper root of me could really fit in with that longer time perspective, sense of being back with an indigenous people, which is so healing for me personally. I love being with indigenous groups. I feel relaxed and at home, and it's pre-agricultural. It's that herding, it's that gathering, hunter-gatherer. I've got, you know, genetically, more than 50% of my genes are hunter-gatherer. So,
wow.
So yes, Nomad fits me beautifully. Thank you very much.
I feel that also ties into the Multilingual Matters team of the Gene Keys. That you that's what you said. That's the hub basically where you feel home, and that is somehow where you get the most variety in one group in the whole Gene Key thing. I believe.
Yeah.
And there is something else that I might be. I can also rationalize anything, right? But there's something I might see a connection with in your chart, and this is beautiful because what I've seen, one of your amazing abilities in the multilingual team is that when there is a dissonance about something, and there is a like a spontaneous. So the first line in the sphere of relating, the Mercury is dissonance. So when there is a dissonance, and there might be some some spontaneous feedback or sharing about it. Then, and that's the second line. So dissonance, feedback, and the third line is assimilation. But the third line kind of sits with that feeling that we are not, there's something here, and like some people are not happy, and there is something that I feel so amazing with you, because instead of actually moving on from that, you make people actually stay with you in that. And from that, your guidance is coming out. And it's been so interesting for me to see, like, by holding the dissonance, almost like holding that there, you can guide. And I also remember when we were in Findhorn, and there was something I said, but can you really speak about a problem without speaking about the solution? Is that constructive? And you said, Bella, can we just first focus on what it is? We don't always have to jump to the solution. And I felt such dissonance in me, and then I got it completely. And then I could see that it wasn't my personal problem. It's a collective thing, that it's so unpopular in society right now to actually speak about a problem without giving the solution. And I feel now, when I see that 7-3, that amazing ability comes from this, and that somehow with that detriment, you've had to look at that discomfort of what it feels to still be in your G center, to still be somehow centered of who you are, where you're going, although there is in relating a dissonance.
Wow. Well, I remember that occasion in Findhorn really well, and for me it was a very beautiful process, and the speed with which you came through it too was just heartwarming and inspiring for me, experiencing that with you. Part of what I'm here to do is to help people feel comfortable with chaos, mm-hmm. and trust that there is an implicate order in chaos. And if we can just give it space to breathe and not take things personally when we're in group situations, then we can actually co-evolve and co-create together. And maybe I had to go through all of those crises. I remember the one and only horoscope, face-to-face horoscope reading I ever had was when I had just actually started my process work training, which was a 7-year period of essential psychotherapy, but from the perspective of process work, which is as much about group work as it is about personal psychology. And I had a horoscope reading with a woman who was part of my training group. And I went in and sat down with her, and I'd had a really bad week. I'd had a whole bunch of things come up in life that were really buffeting me around. And I sat down, and she looked at my chart and she said, well, this is an amazing chart. I have to say, if you can survive all the conflicts that are written in your chart, you're going to be an amazing human being. And it was the last thing I wanted to hear in the moment. It was like, oh, so this is my reality. So life is treating me the way it needs to treat me. But I spent a lot of time studying conflict resolution in groups. And that was a big part of the work I did. For example, I worked in South Africa in the months just leading up to the majority election, when there was a very real chance of civil war. I was working with I was working typically with top management groups of businesses that had to change or die, literally. They either, they weren't going to have the same marketplace that they had had for all their previous life after the majority election. And there was a real chance that civil war would break out at one particular point. I can remember running a workshop for the fast track senior management of a bank, while the bank training center was preparing to receive refugees in what they anticipated was about to be a civil war breaking out through some very nasty things that had been happening. I can remember people coming to work late saying, "I'm really sorry, my next door neighbor got murdered this morning." I mean, it was a tough time. So I've had that background. I've sought, I think, that background, and probably very selfishly to be able to resolve the conflicts in my own, my own blueprint. But I'm also equally, utterly, it's beyond confident. I know that I chose this profile. I know I'm not a victim of my profile. I'm not a victim of those conflicts. I chose that path in order to learn what I've needed to learn to be of service now at a time when things are collapsing around us. Mm-hmm. For me, I've never felt more comfortable. I've never felt better within myself in terms of what is going on. And I have to be careful because I'm so enjoying life, and that's a privilege at a time when so many people are so terrified. And it's not because I take what's going on lightly, because I am in that senior at-risk vulnerable group, and maybe I'm going to be the next statistic. But what I've come knowing into this incarnation is that as long as I'm useful, I'll be here. And when I've done being useful, when I've done being of service, then I can leave. And the thing for me about 42, and I would love to talk with other people who have 42 prominently, is I've never been scared. I've never been consciously scared of dying. Never. And I've had some experiences where it felt I was pretty close to leaving. And even in those moments of, gosh, is this it? I've never felt afraid. I've actually had fear of living.
Yeah.
And I think
I recognize that so much. But isn't that also this 57-4, like the unease of this form?
I read something that you wrote somewhere very recently, Bella, about 57, and I thought, yes, that's it. I kind of identify you as a spirit child. If the worst comes to the worst, we can escape, because we know where we've come from is an infinitely much more beautiful place than this place has been for most of our life. There's a wonderful book by a man called Ben Okri called The Spirit Child. It's about it's quite a tough story to read, but I think he's a Nigerian author, and it's about the spirit child. And when I read it, I thought, oh yes, that's me. I know this story, So that thing about letting go of living and dying, it's almost as though I feel for myself, and I don't know whether this is true for others who have 42 strong in their chart. The challenge is in living. The challenge doesn't come from dying. We know that place. We know that there is nothing, there is no such thing as death. We already know that.
And here I see something there's some kind of infinity 8 structure here with that silence in this SQ. 2442, there's some kind of geometry with what you just said. Maybe you know better than I do. I just see it. It just pops out somehow.
I know that there's a very strong I don't think I can find words for it in this moment. Let me just go inside a minute. Well, all I can say is, that the hours at night that I spend awake are among the most precious for me, because they are, by and large, hours of silence, when the
Yeah.
silence is so loud. And that's part of what's been so beautiful about this time of social distancing, that my neighborhood is so quiet.
Yes.
It's bliss. And it's not just that the noise levels are lower. It's the energetic pause that is part of silence, for me anyway. For
Mm-hmm.
me, silence is spatial,
Yeah.
as well as temporal.
There is something that I feel connected with. I have the same as you. I have nothing in my emotional center. And I can see that that's part of the silence when you're not flooded with outside
Yeah,
emotions and it also, I think, has to do with that 7-3, the ability. Like once I got why it was okay to just say the problem, like once I got that, I actually have no problems of doing it, because it's not going to put me on a wave, it's not going to put me in an emotional state, because actually I can just let it pass through me. And there's something with that completely openness where I guess that's maybe why right now also you feel better than ever, because it doesn't have to hook into anything, it can just pass through somehow.
yeah, that because also, that's my Mercury is in the 12th house. So,
Mm.
and I have Sun, Saturn, and Pluto in the 12th house.
Wow.
And my 42 is in the 12th house. My 42 design is in the 12th house. And I have a huge number of vast array of asteroids in the 12th
Mm.
house. So my being swims in the collective unconscious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to allow myself to socially distance from it is bliss.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have one last question with the charts, and it's a little bit funny because I see that your moon, your attraction is different in both charts, and I think it is actually, let's see, a first line, because but in this one it's a second line, but it doesn't really matter for the 18. Let me see. I'm trying to make my screen. Okay, so
Yes.
you have the 8.
Yeah, that's an old. I actually got a tighter precision on my hour of birth. I
Mm-hmm.
think
Oh,
that's. I think that's because I suspect that's an old human design chart from 2010, and I got a stronger bead on my hour of birth as
mm-hmm.
being an hour earlier than I'd anticipated it was. So I think that's what it is. And the Gene Keys chart will be a newer one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But
So what
certainly
stands
I identify as an 18-1 in my attraction.
right?
I've played with both positions, and I feel, and particularly in terms of chemical relationships with other people,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like a one.
What stands out to me with the 18 that you have both in the moon and then in Neptune, it's that it has that ability to point out what's wrong, or to what needs to be perfected. So if you have 95% right and 5 wrong, it could actually focus in the low frequency on what's wrong, and it could make you want to strive to on a superficial perfection, which is kind of your IQ. Like the brilliant mind is it's kind of an artificial perfection that isn't completely honest. And what I feel is that if Neptune is the outer planet that would veil your truth in Pluto, and together, like there's a feminine aspect of the moon and Neptune together, where you could bypass basically your whole life force in the attraction and your whole feminine essence by going into perfection and focusing on the 5% that are wrong, connected to the 32, instead of seeing everything that is in integrity. And I'm just, that kind of, it feels like it has to do with your life story. And then I'm looking at Pluto and I'm like, you're here to remember. It's like you're here to remember together with others why we're here, and whether it's the spirit child or whether it's to get, to let go of the expectations. That's what you're here to do. But perfection could make you, the wrong kind of perfection could make you bypass the whole part of the transformation that you're here to catalyze for the collective and for yourself.
Yeah, I think one of the most important periods of my life came when I met Arnie Mindell. I don't know if you know Arnie Mindell's work,
No.
process-oriented psychology. I met Arnie in the late 80s and actually studied with him for 7 years. And Arnie was the first person I met whose feedback was utterly sweet and kindly. He was truly, as a teacher, he was he's the only person I've ever truly regarded as my teacher, other than my father, who was a teacher, himself, and was by nature was a very kindly man, but had a very unforgiving God. So he carried this very critical energy himself, largely societally induced. And working with Arnie was a revelation for me, because it was the first time I got really good parenting, good fathering. And also the actual study of process work. A lot of our study, particularly in the early years, was with the inner critic, how to befriend your inner critic. So, from between the age of 30 and 40, I was doing an awful lot of self-study on learning to befriend that inner critic. And the more I became, friends with it, and it became friends with me, the more I could learn to calm it, thank it for what it was trying to do, and actually gently remind it that, there's a time and a place for very, very important time and place for judgment and criticism, and that maybe this particular moment wasn't the best, but, be relaxed, inner critic, you'll get your say. And there again, that 42 is to be able to detach from the tendency to self-criticize. But it all has come through incredibly heavy experiential processes and sort of discovering that in myself, and then recognizing how counterproductive it is. And I can still fall into the 18 judgmental negativity, much less than I used to, but I can't. But I'm aware, and I catch it much more quickly when I fall into it. I notice it much more quickly, and yeah, I think there's a curious way in which I feel that the judge has a hard time of it, because it has had such a big place that it's having to take a back seat, when actually the critical faculty that it can offer is still very, very useful. It's not that it doesn't have a role still. It just needs to learn how to deliver its role in a way that's kinder to itself, and thereby kinder to the whole world. And it starts just very simply not being so hard on myself. And that then takes us straight back to where you came in and asked me at the beginning, that whole 32 failure story, noticing if I've got it wrong, and moving beyond the kind of right and wrong, and accepting what is as being in some way perfectly right. There again, process work was so valuable, because what I learned through studying process was to defer any kind of judgment. You know, your focus is on the signals of what is happening, rather than having made a premature judgment about, is this right or is it wrong? Now let's focus on what is actually happening, recognizing and sharing our perceptions of the signals. And then when we've got clear about what is it that is happening, then we can begin to explore, well, you know, in what way is this actually somehow right? You know, that's, yeah.
I'm curious about, you were going to do a workshop in Manchester. I don't know if that has changed with a date. But
I'm curious about that too.
But I'm curious about what it was and when you might do it, or how it, you know, can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, I can speak to the last part first, when we might do it. What I've committed to with the people who've registered is that I'll go back to them actually now in just a week and see where we are and see where we go from here. It looks pretty much to me at this particular stage that May the 29th in Mount Shasta is pretty unlikely as a face-to-face event. So what I need to do is to talk with all the people who've registered or said they really, you know, hope they can make it. There are various options. We could run it as an online event. I think there are three options that I can think of. Say, well, that was interesting and it's not going to happen, and so bye-bye event. that's one option. And I have to say that I'm sufficiently non-attached that if that were the answer, I'd say, okay, right, we go on to the next thing. Because in a curious way, I think what we're going through at the present time is exactly what the event itself would have been exploring, because it's the myth of Demeter and Persephone. And it's almost as though the human species has been it's been abducted and it's had to go into its own underworld, and it's asking itself all sorts of very challenging questions and being required to examine its inner process. So one option is say, well, you know, events have taken their course and the project isn't needed anymore because we're living it. Another option would be to convert it into an online process. If it was online, it could be an intense event, or it could be a modular event. My own sense at the moment is that if it were to go online, then I would favor the modular, because I think it would take a slightly different form, and we could go deeper, and the period between sessions, say if I ran sessions once a week, or even once every 2 weeks, you know, there'd be time for ripening and reflection. And then the third would be put it back till later. And if we were to put it back altogether to later, then I would not contemplate running it before October, partly because there's a timing, there's a natural timing that is actually associated with the particular myth of Demeter and Persephone. That the weekend that was chosen at the end of May has a particular significance. So it could have its equal and opposite celebration, which would be late October. Or we could even say, well, this is a myth that has survived, you know, over 3,000 years. Its archetypes are going to be as current and relevant in a year's time. And so we might even go for the same weekend next year. But in order to make that decision, I need to talk with my co-hosts, Ed King and Marilyn Winfield, and the people who've already registered, and see, you know, what the general feeling is, because I wouldn't want to make a single arbitrary decision. I'd rather make a collective decision on that, and I'm sure that somewhere is the decision that is exactly the appropriate one, the perfect one for the event. But what I can say about it, and there's some relevance to 42, because when the myth tapped me on the shoulder and said, time to pay attention to this myth, I had no idea about the events that were going to unfold, or that there was going to be so much time available for me to focus. And I have really been doing a lot of self-study, and I've learned so much about myself from this process of preparing for an event that might never happen. And not least, I discovered that I have 3 asteroids in, actually 2 asteroids and a Uranian, that are directly related to the Demeter Persephone myth in Gene Key 42.
Wow.
So, there are no accidents, Bella.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it, because
you are, so tell me, like, just a little.
Just a minute, I need to put my battery in. I need to
Okay.
connect my battery, or else we're going to disappear. I'm sorry to interrupt you in full flow. There we go.
I'm just like to get, because it's myth, it's also archetypal psychology. Like, what are the parts that you are going to do in the workshop? Like, what is the synthesis of things that you're using?
Okay, well, ask a 2-line what they're going to do in an event forward, and I'm slightly tempted to say who knows, but this is what I've learned so far. The story of Demeter and Persephone is the story of the seasons. It's the story of the cycle of the seasons of time, and of death and rebirth. In a sense, Persephone is grabbed from the upper world when she's a young girl gathering flowers on a hillside in ancient Greece or Sicily, according to whether you listen to the Roman or Greek version. And she's abducted by Hades, by the king of the underworld, and taken to the underworld. And her mother, Demeter, is distraught, and is so distraught that she decides that the harvest isn't going to flourish this year. She goes into a state of emotional and psychological winter herself. And so the harvest is about to fail, and Zeus, who's been responsible for the whole business, because he's casually said to his brother, oh yes, you can have my daughter as your bride, yes, but hasn't thought to tell mum about it, or the daughter. He's pretty concerned, and sends his messenger to say, come on, Demeter, buck up, we need harvest. We need these mortals to have their harvest, or else they can't actually give us gods their sacrifices. And she says, no deal, sorry, I need my daughter back, or else this is perpetual winter, mate. And Hades, the king of the older brother actually of Zeus, says, well, okay, no problem. But just have this pomegranate seed before you go, dear Persephone. Enjoyed having you here. And she eats the pomegranate. And once she's eaten the pomegranate, that actually seals her fate, because although she can go back up to the upper world and be reunited with her mother, and spring can come again, when the autumn comes, she is obliged by universal law, because she's eaten of the fruits of the underworld, she has to return to Hades. Now, this is an extraordinary story, because it's a girl who is abducted. You could say that you can read into this story that it is a story of rape, of abduction. It's the Me Too, everything that the Me Too movement has stood against, everything that the Harvey Weinstein trial was set up to say this time and no more. And so you can see it as a kind of archetypal story of our time, when we're actually looking to the Persephones of this world, to the agency of the Persephones and of their mothers to be recognized in full. And so it's a challenge to the continuing energies of patriarchy to change their behavior. In another way, it is actually the story of feminine agency discovering itself, because Persephone, actually the whole thing happens when Persephone sees a Narcissus and reaches to pick the Narcissus flower and pulls it up by the roots, and the earth separates, and up pops Hades from the underworld. And symbolically, what that is about is Persephone actually seeking for self-knowledge. And the only way that she is going to find herself is through what for millennia has been the way of young girls who've been much under their mother's spell, but to fall in love with or to be abducted by a male and married off. And when Persephone actually becomes queen of the underworld, she's in a very privileged position. She's in an equal and opposite position to her mother. She has her own kingdom. There's all the evidence from the literature is that Hades treated her really well, actually, that he shared power. He wasn't a competitive god. He's a very interesting god, actually. And looking at the role of Hades and Persephone and their relationship as husband and wife is also extremely interesting. So there's a huge amount to explore in terms of the archetypes, a very, very rich myth that you can look at from many different perceptions. You know, there's a version of the myth that says actually it wasn't Zeus who gave Persephone to Hades, it was Aphrodite. She was the problem. Venus, she got her tricky little son to shoot an arrow of desire into Pluto, and you know, if it hadn't been for her, Persephone would still be picking flowers on the mountainside happily with her playmates. So there are many different ways to explore it. What is so interesting, I think, to explore is the extent to which this archetype is still unconsciously or consciously influencing and affecting our own personal life and the life of society around us. And it makes for a very interesting study, both at the individual psychology level and the individual spiritual level, because it opens up all kinds of questions around relationship with mother, relationship with nurturing. How were you nurtured as a child? What do you need in order to feel nurtured? How do you nurture? If you're a parent, do you nurture? How do you nurture your friends and your friendships, your relationships? Nurture is the sixth line of 42, by the way, in the radiant sphere. So it's a very, very particular there. Your relationship with father, the absent father, which Zeus essentially was, relationship of the different aspects of father, because there are three fathers in the story, or three strong male king energies. And so exploring all of this and looking at our own inner Persephone. Persephone exists in each and every one of us, whatever our gender, whether we're identify as masculine, feminine, or non-binary. That's Persephone space is the part of us that gives our power away because we don't know who and how we are. And so finding that part that we have given away, the power in ourselves that we've given our way, and also finding that path to self-knowledge and awareness. Persephone is no victim. She sees the Narcissus, although it looks on the surface that she's a victimized 14-year-old, and indeed in the moment she is, but she's chosen the Narcissus. The Narcissus has blinked and twinkled at her, and she's chosen it. And she also chooses to eat the pomegranate, thereby assuring the fact that she will go back to the underworld. But what an amazing power she comes into, because unlike so many of the other god and goddess energies, she spends part of her world, her year in the upper world, and part of her year in the underworld. So she actually ends up as queen. She is an extraordinarily balanced and mature being, added to which she has the glorious companionship of that wonderful crone Hecate, who was by Zeus, who was the king of the gods. Zeus himself revered Hecate beyond and above all other goddess energies. So much there to explore together. Fun, you know, exploring the archetypes is fun. It's storytelling. It's what as a 56 I love to do. It nourishes me, and hopefully it can nourish other people. But then again, it may have been just a passing something that will never even see the light of day. I don't know. Watch this space, Bella. I will know more after next week when I've connected in with everybody else and got a sense of the temperature of is it going to happen or isn't it going to happen? What form, if it's going to happen, is it going to take? Or are we not even ready yet to make that decision? That's also a possibility.
But I feel like I wouldn't have asked you if it wasn't kind of up in the air. I wouldn't have asked you, and I wouldn't have known everything you told me. And I feel like I can see my life in it. I can see you before 6 years old, and then being in the hospital, and then being in Corsica, like, you know, reclaiming your power. Like, it's like everything that we spoke about is just like intertwined, or it's just like, you know, symbolized in the story. So I'm so happy.
Well, as I said, I've really just, you know, the experience of researching this and going into it and exploring the ideas around, you know, how if it's this type of event, you know, how would we explore that? And it's just been such fun. It's been so interesting, and I've learned a lot about myself along the way. And that for the person that I am, you know, an eternal learner in this lifetime, is a joy.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like we went over so much. Is there any last thing that you feel like we have forgotten about?
Goodness, what last thing? Well, next time we talk, I'd love to talk about Sedna. You know, she also, Sedna, there's a really special and important place for Sedna in this time. She's actually the higher, I'm pretty sure she's the higher octave. I've just found a wonderful book by somebody called Alan Clay. My Sedna is in 42. And there's a wonderful book about Sedna called Sedna Consciousness. So I had read a book about Sedna a while ago by somebody called Jennifer Gare, which was about the return of Sedna. She's an amazing, amazing asteroid because she, first of all, you know, she takes 11,500 years to orbit. Which just happens to be half of the precession of the equinox. And she's on her way back. She will reach her closest point to Earth in, I think it's 2076. It'll be long after I've left the planet anyway. And she'll be back, and she'll be in Cancer. So, and because I have a sun sign in Cancer, I have a special affinity for Cancer. She was discovered when she was discovered in Gene Key 2 line 6, which is the double earth hexagram, you know, the receptive.
It's my Chiron, actually. So
yeah,
something feels here, yeah.
Right. And she really, I think, holds a very special place archetypally in what she's bringing back. She's the furthest. She's the furthest out. So for me, as a, you know, with a 35 creativity, and now in my progressed chart as my life's work, she just appeals to the adventure spirit of me. You know, that she's so far out, and she'll come back in. She's in this area in the cosmos called the inner Oort cloud, and she'll never get nearer than. I don't think she'll ever get into the orbit of any of the outer planets as we know them. And the notion of her is this higher octave of Demeter, of the real deep, deep feminine that we're reclaiming, and that the asteroids help us to reclaim through these archetypal stories, and recognizing where the energies are operating in our charts is something absolutely fascinating to explore. So maybe sometime we'll do a Sedna session.
Maybe we'll do it for my birthday in a month, because we are going to be in the second hexagram, and I would love to do it.
What's your
actual
birthday?
May 7.
Oh wow, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's have a Sedna session.
I would love it. If it's like a birthday present, I would love that.
Okay. Let's make sure to do it then. On or around your birthday, you decide. You tell me the date and place and time, and whether we're going to make it a party. We could make it a party, couldn't we?
Of course.
Invite our nearest and dearest. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the invitation, Bella. Thank you for wonderful questions.
Yeah, and thank you for your ability of being a storyteller. It's just so enjoyable. Yeah.
Well, I love hanging with you anytime, any place. So, till May the 7th then.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, lots and lots of love.